What happens when a powerful judge underestimates the wrong woman? When a courtroom meant for justice becomes a stage for corruption? Renee Carter walked into court as a defendant, mocked and dismissed at every turn. But what no one knew was that she held a secret that would shake the entire system. When the truth is finally revealed, karma comes knocking. Will justice prevail, or will power and influence win once again? Watch till the end to find out. Like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of justice and resilience. The Cedarwood County Courthouse was packed with onlookers eager for their latest dose of small-town drama. The scent of old paper and varnished wood filled the air, mingling with the faint murmurs of those watching the spectacle unfold. At the defendant's table sat Renee Carter, poised and composed. She was not the kind of defendant this town was used to seeing. No nervous glances, no hunched shoulders, no frantic whispering with a lawyer. Instead, she sat straight-backed, her navy blue suit crisp, her expression unreadable. Across the room, Judge Benjamin Whitmore adjusted his robe with slow, deliberate movements. He had presided over this court for decades and had seen all kinds of cases, but something about Renee irked him. Maybe it was her calmness. Maybe it was the fact that she had chosen to represent herself. Women like her didn't challenge men like him. Seated at the prosecution's table was Gregory Hastings, the supposed victim. A wealthy businessman with deep connections in local politics, he wore his usual air of arrogance, his pristine gray suit a testament to his power. To the town, he was an upstanding citizen. To Renee, he was something far worse. The charge: assault. According to Hastings, Renee had attacked him outside an upscale restaurant, an act of violence with no provocation. At least, that was the story he spun for the press. In a town where power and perception meant everything, her guilt had already been decided before she ever stepped into the courtroom. The gavel slammed against the wood. "Miss Carter," Judge Whitmore's voice carried the weight of smug authority. "Do you understand the seriousness of these charges?" Renee met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor," a pause. "And yet you've chosen to represent yourself." He leaned forward as if daring her to admit she was out of her depth. "Yes." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Defendants in Cedarwood didn't do that. Whitmore exhaled sharply, already dismissive. "Very well," he muttered, before glancing at the prosecutor. Nobody in the room knew the truth. Renee Carter was not just a defendant. She was an undercover FBI agent, and she was here for much more than this trial. The tension in the Cedarwood County Courthouse was palpable. The quiet murmur of onlookers had settled into an uneasy hush as the proceedings began. Judge Benjamin Whitmore adjusted his glasses and gave Renee Carter the same look one might give a child who had wandered into an adult conversation. "Miss Carter," he drawled, tapping his gavel lightly on the bench. "I assume you're aware that representing yourself is unwise." "I'm aware of my constitutional rights, Your Honor," Renee replied, her tone even. Whitmore exhaled sharply. "We'll see," he muttered. Across the room, Prosecutor Elizabeth Connors sat with her hands folded neatly in front of her. She was a seasoned attorney, sharp, methodical, and known for keeping her emotions out of the courtroom. But even she couldn't ignore the subtle hostility in Whitmore's tone. Hastings sat smugly at the prosecution's table, occasionally exchanging glances with Whitmore as if the verdict was already secured. Renee took a breath and stood. It was time to introduce her first piece of evidence. "Your Honor, I would like to present security footage from outside Cedarwood Grill on the night in question." Renee walked to the evidence screen and clicked the remote. The grainy black and white footage flickered to life. The courtroom watched as the screen clearly showed Gregory Hastings grabbing Renee's wrist, pulling her toward him before she shoved him away. A murmur rippled through the gallery. This wasn't an unprovoked assault. It was self-defense. But Judge Whitmore barely glanced at the screen. "This footage is inconclusive," he declared, waving a dismissive hand. "It's grainy and the angle makes it difficult to determine intent. A few seconds of video does not provide full context." Renee stiffened. This wasn't about evidence, it was about control. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said carefully, "it clearly shows. I will not allow grandstanding in my courtroom, Miss Carter." Whitmore's voice cut through the air like a blade. "If that is the best you have, I strongly suggest reconsidering your approach." Renee clenched her jaw, but she didn't push further. Not yet. From the prosecution's table, Connors watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. She had prosecuted dozens of cases under Whitmore, but this was something else. The way he had shut Renee down so quickly, it was as if he had already decided how this trial would end. Renee sat back down, but her mind was racing. Why was Whitmore so eager to dismiss the evidence? Her instincts screamed that Hastings was more than just a businessman with influence. He was part of something bigger. And now, she wasn't just fighting for her innocence. She was fighting to uncover the truth. The atmosphere inside Cedarwood County Courthouse grew heavier with each passing minute. The once idle chatter among the spectators had died down, replaced by an eerie stillness as the trial unfolded. Renee Carter could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her, but she remained calm, focused, and unshaken. This wasn't just about clearing her name. This was about exposing the deep-rooted corruption that had poisoned Cedarwood County for years. For months, she had been operating as an undercover FBI agent, carefully infiltrating the town to investigate a network of money laundering, land fraud, and corruption. Hastings was just one piece of the puzzle, but she was beginning to realize Judge Whitmore was another. She had suspected it for weeks. His rulings, his connections, his insistence on dismissing crucial evidence. But now, as she stood in the middle of the courtroom watching him protect Hastings at every turn, she was certain. Whitmore wasn't just a biased judge. He was part of the very system she had been sent to destroy. Renee's investigation had led her to two key witnesses. 1 week before the trial, Renee had met Martha Gaines, the town's elderly librarian, in the dimly lit backroom of the Cedarwood Public Library. Martha, despite her frail appearance, was sharp, observant, and had spent years quietly compiling records of suspicious land deals tied to Hastings. "They force people out," she had whispered, sliding a thick folder across the wooden table. "They manipulate county records, falsify signatures, and when that doesn't work, well, people just disappear." Renee had flipped through the documents, property transfers that didn't add up, contracts with forged signatures, land surveys approved under questionable circumstances. All of them led back to Hastings. "I knew something wasn't right," Martha had said, "but no one listens to an old woman." Renee had squeezed her hand. "I do." But she needed more than property records. She needed hard proof of financial crimes. That's where Ethan Boyle came in. A former real estate agent who had once worked directly under Hastings. Ethan had been smart enough to leave before things got too dangerous. But even from the outside, he had seen enough to know how deep the corruption ran. They had met at an abandoned construction site, where he passed her a USB drive filled with financial records, wire transfers, and transactions that confirmed money laundering on a massive scale. "I shouldn't be doing this," Ethan had muttered, his hands shaking. "If they find out, they won't," Renee had assured him. "Not until it's too late." What she didn't tell him was that she wasn't just planning to use the evidence. She was going to bring down the entire operation. Back in the courtroom, Hastings sat at the prosecution's table with his usual smug expression. He still believed he was untouchable. Renee was about to change that. She stood, her hands steady as she prepared for cross-examination. "Mr. Hastings," she began, her voice controlled, "can you confirm where you were on the night of September 4th?" Hastings leaned back, flashing an almost lazy smile. "At Cedarwood Grill." "And what time did you arrive?" "Around 8 p.m. Renee tilted her head. "That's interesting, because according to your sworn statement, you were at a private fundraiser that evening. Do you need me to refresh your memory?" A flicker of hesitation crossed Hastings' face. For the first time, he looked unsure. I must have misremembered." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. She had just caught him in a lie. Judge Whitmore slammed his gavel down. "Let's not waste time on trivial inconsistencies." Renee turned to him, her expression unreadable. "With all due respect, Your Honor, determining whether the prosecution's key witness is lying is hardly trivial." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "Move on, Miss Carter." Renee didn't argue, but she wasn't finished. She held up a printed financial report, one of the documents Ethan had given her. "Mr. Hastings," she continued, "can you explain why your company received a $250,000 deposit from a Cayman Islands account registered under the name Horizon Developments, an entity that, as of last month, does not exist?" The color drained from Hastings' face. I don't know what you're talking about." Renee arched an eyebrow. "Would you like to review the bank statements before answering?" More whispers erupted in the gallery. Whitmore leaned forward. "Enough. This line of questioning is irrelevant." "It's relevant if Hastings is involved in financial crimes," Renee interrupted. Whitmore's face darkened. "I will not allow you to turn this into a witch hunt." Renee stared at him. The tension between them thickened like a storm gathering over the town. And that was when Prosecutor Elizabeth Connors finally spoke up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice measured but firm, "if Miss Carter's claims can be substantiated, they fall under criminal liability statutes. I'd like to request a recess to review the financial documents in question." For the first time since the trial began, Judge Whitmore looked uneasy. He adjusted his robe, the sharpness in his eyes dulling into something else, worry. Renee watched him carefully. She had been right all along. Whitmore wasn't just protecting Hastings. He was protecting himself, and that meant only one thing: the walls were closing in on him. Whitmore cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "Motion denied. We will proceed with closing arguments tomorrow morning." Elizabeth Connor's eyes flickered with suspicion. Renee didn't react. She had all the evidence she needed. And tomorrow, she was going to bring the whole operation crashing down. The Cedarwood County Courthouse buzzed with tension. The trial was nearing its conclusion, and Judge Benjamin Whitmore looked impatient. His fingers tapped against the bench, his eyes filled with barely concealed irritation. Renee Carter sat at the defense table, calm, waiting. She had spent months undercover as an FBI agent, gathering evidence on the corruption web that stretched from Hastings' real estate empire to Whitmore's courtroom. She had already sent everything to the Bureau hours ago. The only thing left was to watch the house of cards collapse. Whitmore cleared his throat. "This trial has gone on long enough," he announced. "Closing arguments will begin now, and the jury will deliberate by this afternoon." Across the room, Prosecutor Elizabeth Connor's brows furrowed. "Your Honor, the defense has yet to finish presenting." "We've heard enough," Whitmore snapped, cutting her off. Renee said nothing. He was rushing because he knew what was coming. Before Whitmore could continue, the heavy courtroom doors burst open. A wave of gasps filled the room as a team of federal agents entered, their crisp suits and flashing badges commanding silence. At the front of the group stood Special Agent Noah Ramirez, his expression unreadable. The crowd whispered in shock, jurors exchanged nervous glances, and Gregory Hastings stiffened in his seat. "What the hell is this?" Hastings demanded, rising from the prosecution's table. Ramirez didn't blink. "Gregory Hastings," he announced, his voice steady. "You are under arrest for money laundering, fraud, and conspiracy." The courtroom erupted into stunned murmurs as two agents stepped forward, gripping Hastings' arms. "This is insane," Hastings roared. "You have no proof." "We have plenty," Ramirez countered, holding up a thick folder of evidence. Hastings' face drained of color, but it wasn't over yet. Ramirez turned to Judge Whitmore. "And you, Your Honor," he said smoothly, "are under investigation for judicial corruption." The room fell deathly silent. Whitmore froze. "This is outrageous," he hissed. "You have no jurisdiction." Ramirez raised an eyebrow and produced a federal warrant. "This was issued by the U.S. District Court," he said. "Your jurisdiction is no longer relevant." Whitmore gripped the bench, his knuckles white. At that moment, Renee Carter stood. Every eye in the courtroom turned to her as she reached into her jacket. "I can confirm these allegations," she said calmly. Ramirez nodded once. "Miss Carter, would you care to identify yourself for the record?" Renee pulled out her badge, holding it up for all to see. "Special Agent Renee Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The courtroom exploded in gasps. Even Elizabeth Connors, who had suspected something was off, looked stunned. The jurors whispered among themselves. The gallery sat in stunned silence. Hastings looked like he had been struck. But the real moment came when Renee turned to Judge Whitmore. His face was pale. His breath came short. "You mocked me," Renee said softly. "You dismissed my evidence. You tried to silence me." She stepped closer. "But you never stopped to wonder why I wasn't afraid of you." Whitmore's lips parted, but no words came out. Because now he knew. Hastings struggled against the agents, spewing curses. "This is a setup," he shouted. "You can't do this. I have friends in high places." Ramirez didn't even blink. "I'm sure you do," he said flatly. "And I'm sure we'll be seeing them soon." Whitmore gripped the arms of his chair like a man about to drown. "Do you really think this will stand?" he muttered. "You have nothing on me." Ramirez gestured toward an agent who handed over a thick folder of financial records. "We have offshore bank accounts linked directly to bribes from Hastings' real estate firm," he said. "You signed over 24 fraudulent rulings in his favor." Whitmore's mouth went dry. He reached for his gavel, as if clinging to the last shred of his authority. An agent stepped forward. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Whitmore's hand dropped. For the first time in his career, Judge Benjamin Whitmore had no power left. And as the reality of his downfall crashed over him, his legs buckled slightly. Renee watched it all unfold. The corrupt judge, the arrogant businessman, the system that had controlled Cedarwood for years, all of it was falling apart, and it had all begun with the woman they had underestimated. The Cedarwood County Courthouse had never seen a spectacle like this. The very men who had wielded power over the town, who had manipulated the law for their own gain, were now the ones being led away in handcuffs. Gregory Hastings' face was red with fury as he struggled against the agents holding him. "This is a joke," he bellowed. "I own this town. You'll regret this." Judge Benjamin Whitmore, however, was silent. His once commanding presence was reduced to a shadow of itself as he stood frozen in place, his robe still hanging over his shoulders. But the authority it once represented was gone. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly as an agent gripped his arm and guided him down from the bench. The gallery was silent, many of the spectators too stunned to react. For years, people had whispered about corruption in Cedarwood. Now, there was no denying it. The town was shaken to its core. As Hastings and Whitmore were led through the courtroom doors, a ripple of uneasy realization settled over Cedarwood's residents. The justice system they had trusted had been compromised all along, and it had taken an outsider, a woman they had mocked, underestimated, and nearly convicted, to expose the truth. Days later, Renee sat in her Washington, D.C. office, looking at a pile of letters on her desk. Some were from Cedarwood residents, people who had long suspected something was wrong but had been too afraid to speak. "Thank you for standing up when no one else could. People in this town are finally talking openly about what's been happening because of you. You gave us our courage back." Renee exhaled slowly, allowing herself a small smile. This was why she did what she did. Her job wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about restoring faith in justice. In a packed federal courtroom in Houston, Judge Benjamin Whitmore sat at the defendant's table, no longer on the bench, no longer in control. His hands were shackled, his once pristine robe replaced by a plain gray prison jumpsuit. The headlines were everywhere. FBI agent who took down corrupt judge exposes deep-rooted fraud in Cedarwood County. The trial that turned the tables, how Renee Carter's investigation changed everything. As reporters flashed cameras, Renee remained in the background, watching quietly. She didn't need the spotlight. The truth had already spoken for itself. As Renee Carter walked out of the federal courthouse, she felt the weight of the case finally lift from her shoulders. The long months of deception, risk, and relentless pursuit of the truth had all led to this moment. Justice had prevailed. Cedarwood County would never be the same. The townspeople had seen the fall of a corrupt judge and a powerful businessman, both of whom had once seemed untouchable. The legal system they had trusted had failed them, but now it had been reclaimed. Renee knew this was only one victory in a much larger fight. There would always be others like Whitmore and Hastings, men who thrived on power and corruption. But there would also always be people like her, willing to stand up, willing to fight. Justice can be delayed, but it can never be denied. Those who abuse power will eventually face consequences. Standing up for truth and justice is never easy, but it is always worth it. As she drove back to FBI headquarters in Washington, she glanced at the sun breaking through the clouds. In the end, karma had done its job, and it always would.